All right. Welcome, everybody. It's my great pleasure to open this season's lecture series, the Global Solidarity Lecture Series. My name is Kati Widlak, as you can see, and I'm here in Vienna. I'm at the University of Vienna. Yeah, I don't want to say too much, but I really encourage you to put on your cameras when we are in the big group, because it feels so much better when somebody's speaking and can see actually whom they are speaking to. So if you can, please put on your camera. Um, Right, we will start in a second, or Diana Fox, our today's speaker, will start in a second. She will be introduced by Sayan Day. And I don't want to say too much about Sayan because he is also one of our speakers of the series and he will be introduced tomorrow properly before his talk. But I want to mention that he is the co-teacher of this year's Decolonial Studies seminar, and just a fantastic scholar. I invite you to come to his talk tomorrow. But before that, as I said, we are here for Diana Fox's talk, and please, Diane, introduce Diana properly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And as I always find, it's so happily amazing that we are just sitting in so many diverse time zones. For some, it can be very comfortable. For some, it may not be much of comfort, but at the end, it's the NYI that always brings us together and motivates us together. Without wasting much time, I'm so happy, so super excited, like all of us, to have Diana with us. And it makes me specifically very excited because I have been personally very familiar with Diana's work, I think for the last at least 10 years, if not more. And with respect to our work for the Journal of International Women's Studies, the tremendous support that the journal has always extended to me and many of us research projects centered on gender and sexuality and various other gender aspects with respect to the fellowship programs and all, and the wonderful place that and the spaces of knowledge sharing that they have always curated across the world. So Professor Diana J. Fox is currently the interim university director at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the regional headquarters of the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. And she's a full-time professor at the Bridgewater State University simultaneously. She's a cultural and activist anthropologist, decolonial feminist scholar activist, and documentary film producer. Her work has focused on the Anglophone Caribbean, particularly Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, whereas scholar activism has focused on issues of gender justice and sexuality, Indigenous peoples' rights and resilience, Indigenous women's knowledges, women's social movement activism for ecological sustainability, women's human rights, and transnational feminisms. Since 2015, her fieldwork and scholar activism has expanded women's issues in Asia, particularly Nepal and Japan. She conducted ethnographic research in Eritrea following the war with Ethiopia on women's rights and FGM. She serves on the International Advisory Board of Fundus Amandus Community Reforestation Project, which is widely known by the acronym FSCRP, in Trinidad and Tobago, the Sexualities Working Group of the Caribbean Studies Association, the Board of Friends of ADWAN, Association of Dalit Women's Advancement, Nepal, She's the founder and editor of the open access online journal, which I just mentioned, the Journal of the International Women's Studies, and is a recipient of 4 Fulbright scholarships as well as other grants and awards. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, to be honest. And she is more accolades. She has done fantastic work, and she keeps on doing amazing work with communities. And I'm sure the topic that she's going to reflect about working together with Indigenous communities has to do with a lot with the creative methods, creative perspectives, and most importantly, the question that we keep on visiting and revisiting, that how and in what ways do we work with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, cultures, and traditions by consciously and unconsciously not falling into the colonial methodological traps of data hunting and data mining and the extractivisms that are still very much prominent across the world. So now the stage is all yours, Diana, and we are super excited to hear you and learn with you. Thank you so much once again.
Well, thank you so much, Ayan, for that wonderful introduction. I can't believe it's 10 years already. Time just like literally flies. And thank you also to the whole Global Solidarity Lecture Series, Katerina. I really appreciate all of the organizing you've done, and the IT team, John, as well. Let me jump right in and first say what a pleasure and an honor it is to be here with all of you. There is, I think, at least one person joining me from the Caribbean, so that's great, and it's fantastic to see you all from all over the globe. So I'm going to share my screen. I have, of course, a PowerPoint. Some of the slides I'll go through more quickly than others, but some have photographs that I really want to show you some of the images of the people that I've been working with for some time now. So let me jump right in here. And I guess, do I need to put on the voice recording, or are you all for the text, or is that not necessary?
I think it's fine, Diana.
It's fine. Okay.
Yeah.
So my talk is called Collaborating with Indigenous Peoples, the Ethics of Decolonial Feminist Anthropology. And I have been developing a way to work with not only Indigenous peoples, but all groups that I have collaborated with over the many years that I've been a practicing anthropologist. I got my PhD in '95, so it's been a while. And since that time, of course, the discussions around decolonial discourse and Indigenous praxis have developed. So that has also given me more of an opportunity to think through my engagement. And I begin here, if you can see in my title here, I've highlighted Jamaica, but following that, I've highlighted the Indigenous word, the Taino word for Jamaica, which is Yame. And you'll see a map shortly where I'm going to point out some of the challenges around naming and mapping. So let me just briefly overview my talk outline. I'm going to begin by showing you a couple of maps of Caribbean Indigenous geographies. It's a challenging project because many of the Indigenous names are not well known, and it's very difficult to find maps with all of the Indigenous names in the region. The first map I'm going to show you is not an Indigenous map, and the second one is of the Eastern Caribbean that shows some of the Indigenous names. Then I'm going to explain to you the process that I've been developing over the last, 15 years or so, around what it means to develop feminist decolonial partnerships, what are the ethical expectations of engaging in these partnerships, and then I'm going to talk about this idea of friendships as a dimension of social activism. We'll get into that in more detail shortly. I want to also share with you what it means to be Indigenous. There are various features of indigeneity that are foundational to understanding what we mean when we talk about Indigenous peoples. And then, in addition to the ethical expectations that I think are a prerequisite to working with Indigenous peoples, there are also legal requirements The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been ratified by many countries around the world. And while it itself is not a treaty, it's not law, it's a moral document. Many of the articles in the document are undergirded by treaty law. So various international human rights conventions that countries have ratified. One of those tenets is the idea of free, prior, and informed consent, which I'm going to review with you, which stems also from an ethical obligation, but is rooted in law. Then I'm going to share with you a couple of examples of my work with Maroons as well as First Peoples. Both are Indigenous, but Maroons are not First Peoples, and I'll explain a little bit about that and identify some of the work that I've been doing listed here: organizing conferences, attending collaboratively, collaborative publishing, celebrating indigeneity and identity, learning from each other, and storytelling. And then I'm going to close with some of the work that's currently in process. Well, all of it is ongoing, but very recently I developed a set of ethical guidelines for the Caribbean Development Bank to work with Indigenous peoples. So I'm going to share with you some of those guidelines. Okay. Okay, so moving into the map, just to get you oriented. Here is the Caribbean, which also includes Guyana and Suriname. These are known as the Eastern Caribbean or Lesser Antilles, these larger islands south of Florida here are the Greater Antilles. Belize is often considered part of the Caribbean. It borders the Caribbean Sea, and there's been a significant migration around the region. So you find Caribbean populations throughout this area, as well as further north. In fact, some Caribbean peoples have talked about Toronto being the northernmost Caribbean city, since there's such a significant diasporic population. Guyana and Suriname are considered part of the region because of a shared history that is distinct from the history of other South American countries, largely in its demographics and colonization process. So this is the non-Indigenous map. And I spent about 2 hours or so looking for a map like this that had all Indigenous names, and I wasn't able to find it. What I was able to find is this map of the Eastern Caribbean. And what I love about this is that it doesn't have the colonial names next to it. And noticed it was collected by a colonial person himself, a British colonial person in the 1640s. Waitukabuli is Dominica. And so there's some, I bring attention to this in particular because there was a Maroon gathering of Maroons from across the region. Maroons are descendants of escaped enslaved Africans. Some Maroons were also First Peoples, but I work with some who are descendant from both, but primarily African descendant Maroons. And they created a process called grand marronage. There's also petit marronage. Grand marronage is when people created free communities and systems of governance, as well as reproducing aspects of cultural practices from the societies that they came from. Petit marronage refers to individual or small groups escaping and integrating into wider society rather than setting up free enclaves and communities. Just to point out so you get a sense of orientation, this where I'm circling my arrow, Ichiroganim, that's Barbados. So I'm not going to go more deeply into this, except to say that wherever we all are, there are names that came before you. And particularly in spaces of settler colonialism, the erasure of Indigenous names is part of the process of the invisibilization of Indigenous peoples. So understanding where you are and what were the names that came before is one very simple process, actually, but an important one of reorienting your geography and engaging with the history of resurfacing Indigenous names and Indigenous life ways. So let me jump right in now to talking about what are decolonial feminist collaborations and partnerships and their ethical expectations. I just wanted to share briefly that I came of age as an anthropologist in the 1980s in the United States. When I was a college student and undergraduate in the 80s. And at that time, anthropology, which is a colonial discipline, it was created during the colonial period, and some of the earliest anthropologists were colonial administrators, and some missionaries, in fact, became anthropologists or worked alongside anthropologists. Some of them, in fact, became very well integrated into communities. But at this time, anthropology was looking at itself in what we call its self-reflexive moment, trying to understand the processes of representation of others and the power dynamics that were created and reproduced in anthropological fieldwork. And so I came of age during this time when the history of colonial practices was being interrogated. And so it set me up to start thinking about how I could become an anthropologist, someone interested in the world's cultural diversity, why cultural diversity exists, and how anthropology can work in service to, in partnership and collaboration with those who had previously been and continue to be influenced by the frameworks of coloniality. So the term partner defines a relationship in which two or more groups of people who may occupy different positions socioculturally, in terms of class, and other positionalities that you might identify, ethnicity, race, religion, and the like, work together to achieve a common goal. And central to this idea as of the relationship is the presumption of equality, which is crucially important because it is oftentimes those positionalities that are imbued with inequities themselves. They were created, in fact, through inequitable relationships. So crafting a notion of partnership itself is initially an act of decoloniality. However, sustaining partnerships over time is where the real challenge emerges. Working cooperatively towards that common goal, it reads easily, but the work itself it requires constant engagement, a reminder of mutual respect, and the recognition that partners may not agree on everything. And I borrowed this from the African feminist scholar Nkiru and Zegwu, and have also built upon it. So these aspects below, highlighted in bullets, are what I have developed myself in elaborating on Zegwu's understanding of partnerships. So foundationally, it's crucial to think about caring relationships. These have interpersonal dynamics, and these interpersonal dynamics become a foundation for political action. Now, what that means, I think, will become clearer as I continue through the talk. We have to listen and learn together. We have to decenter neoliberal linear ways of knowing, thinking about time as money, and those kinds of problematic ways of thinking. It's true that resources are scarce, and so is time. But listening and learning together has to be removed from the immediacy of thinking about time in terms of earning. Otherwise, we won't listen openly. We won't take the time that is needed to really understand various perspectives. Following these processes of talking together, learning together, we can begin to think together about how to intentionally collaborate around things such as co-authorship. What does it mean to write together? What does it mean when one of the partners or some of the partners are academically trained in certain writing processes and formats, whereas others may come from storytelling traditions that are not linear, that don't have a beginning and a middle and an end, but have very different ways of sharing ideas. Grant writing together, traveling to conferences, disrupting academic success measures. So for instance, we are continually thrust with the neoliberal business model of the university measurements of success, whether it's indexing or how many downloads or things like that. Well, that's not totally unimportant. It's also a disservice to only think in those ways. There will also be disagreements. Those are inevitable. So figuring out how to respectfully disagree and continually evaluating one's roles and dynamics over time. Now, the relationships that I've been in with some of my Maroon partners have been over 20 years long. So it's given me a lot of opportunity to think about how these relationships have changed over time. Sometimes there's been cooling off periods. There's been a lot of ebb and flow. So I have more recently begun to think about how particular Indigenous concepts, particularly the Lakota concept of Mitokoweasin, which means all my relations, can be incorporated into this notion of decolonial partnerships. In the colonial version of field work and conducting anthropological data collection, those whom we work with have historically been referred to as informants, a term which has made me deeply uncomfortable from my student days because it has an aura of sort of secrecy or the clandestine about it. And another term, a related term, is fictive kin. Fictive kin refers to this idea of developing close relationships and that resemble family ties, but they are not real family ties. So what does it mean to have a real family tie? Every culture has its kinship systems. Whether they refer to marriage within the group, marriage outside the group, but also deep friendships come to resemble or be equatable with kinship. And so I have thought about increasingly the decolonial partnerships that I have enacted collaboratively as friendships, because similarly, I'm not going to have time to share this. By the way, this there's a little video here where an Indigenous Lakota man speaks about the idea of all my relations, which is an extension of kinship beyond human beings. It links human beings to the natural world. Generally, Indigenous people globally see themselves as related to all beings. And that is a foundational concept to moving into challenging fictive kin, replacing it with actual kinship generated through these close bonds of friendship, which rest on this idea of a relationality. There's a book, a relatively new book that came out in 2018. You can see it cited below, Friendship as Social Justice Activism, Critical Solidarities in a Global Perspective. And the idea here is that friendships are forged, whether across a lifetime or in shorter periods, that pertain to this awareness of others. That awareness of engaging with others deeply also rests on going through journeys together of pain and loss. For instance, we lose people, people that were in these relationships lose people. And so we're envisioning a working relationship that is deeply rooted in the range of human emotions. Across those losses, across those transformations, there's a desire to endure. And this, I'm going to read this verbatim here. Friendship as social activism appears as an ethico-political relationship. That is a relationship rooted in ethics and expectations of one another that is also political because it involves power dynamics. Whether the power dynamics stem from class distinctions or race privilege or whatever it may be, those have to be addressed openly in any kind of solidarity of social transformative activism. Friendships are brought into existence through the construction of an ethics around writing. So, in other words, friendships may not pre-exist this collaboration, but emerge through collaboration. And as they emerge, the responsibility to one another helps to strengthen and deepen the commitments to whatever causes, whatever kind of social transformations are part of the collaborative process. So I want to move into another topic now, which is to look at the way in which we can understand who Indigenous peoples are, knowing how we define particular groups, even loosely, is important for entering into these kind of friendship dynamics with one another. The first, and I'm drawing this from the UN, which of course is informed by the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is one of the newest arenas of the United Nations. And it was created by the activism of Indigenous peoples, as well as those working as allies and in collaboration with Indigenous peoples and their scholarship. One of the first points that emerges is that Indigenous peoples are Indigenous peoples if they identify as such, but not just individually identify. They need to be recognized by other Indigenous peoples as Indigenous. They have a particularly distinct culture, a common history. They've occupied a territory of ancestral lands for generations. What is crucially important, especially for work with Maroons, who are not First Peoples, is that this occupation of a territory does not have to be pre-colonial. So Maroons who originally were torn from lands in Africa are First Peoples. They're descendants of First Peoples of Africa, but they retained and sustained their indigeneity in the Caribbean. Indigenous peoples the world over have a particularly special relationship with the lands they occupy, a spiritual relationship that is reflected in that Lakota concept. And while that concept of all my relations I shared the Lakota word for it, you can find similar terms across Indigenous groups around the world. So who is Indigenous in the Caribbean? Just a list of a few peoples, the Kalinago, the Taino, the Waro, the Kalinago are in Dominica, Taino are in Puerto Rico and Jamaica, just by some examples. Waro are in Trinidad. Maroons exist wherever there was African enslavement. Wherever there was enslavement, there was resistance and marronage. And Maroons exist as distinct communities with a particular, and I want to emphasize this word, African ethnogenesis. Ethnogenesis referring to the emergence of new cultural forms as well, because Africans were stolen from many lands with many languages, and the communities that they established in many parts of the region had multiple languages and multiple cultural practices. And so in some spaces, there was an effort to identify common practices, common language, common aspects of language. But this also, and I don't have time to go into this, but it's important to recognize that there were different systems of coloniality. So in the Dutch colonial spaces in the Caribbean, language retention by African groups was significant. Groups were not separated by languages. So the 6 Maroon groups of Suriname have languages today that have evolved from their original languages, which is very different from Maroons in other places where language groups were mixed. Despite identifying Indigenous peoples in the region, they still face narratives of extinction. Many people believe that they've all been disappeared. They continue to be invisibilized and marginalized. In most Caribbean spaces, there is no representation in government. In Dominica or Waitif Kabuli, there is a member of parliament from Dominica, and the current president of Dominica is actually a Kalinaga woman. It is the only place where there is an actual territory for First Peoples. And throughout the rest of the region, there is not representation in the colonial government, which still exists, which is a government that is independent from the European colonial forces, but nonetheless colonial to First Peoples and Indigenous peoples, but it is not their initial and original system of government. Okay. Very briefly here, there are some concepts that are important to understand when you're working with Indigenous peoples. What is Indigenous knowledge? How has it emerged? How is it gendered? How have women and men, based on different roles and the social groupings that they're in, how have they developed different knowledge systems? What are the understandings of gender and the gender groupings that exist within Indigenous communities? The concept of Indigenous personhood is also tied to this notion of all my relations and the interconnectedness of human beings with all other living things. All beings have personhood, not just human beings. And in working with Indigenous peoples in their social movements and aligning themselves, and aligning myself with Indigenous social movements and offering my collaborative and partnership capacity, I have observed that in the Caribbean, as well as in other parts of the world, these movements are often led by women. Now, if we move on now to the legal aspect of things, I had mentioned the importance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so when working with Indigenous peoples, it's important not to say I personally have my own ethical construct that I've shared in my partnerships with people, but also to take into account the broader global system of that recognizes Indigenous peoples as persons with self-determination and who are seeking sovereignty, but who are sovereign individuals. And the notion of free, prior, informed consent requires that anybody doing research or with Indigenous peoples or any companies, any businesses must, without pressure, share the nature of the work that they want to do, the impact that any project may have on the community or on the lands. This must be done prior to any intervention. First Peoples must feel, and Indigenous peoples must feel fully informed. Information must be ongoing. It's processual. It's not just a lump of information in the beginning, but throughout the project as new information comes in. And First Peoples, and I keep saying First Peoples, but I really should be saying Indigenous peoples more broadly because First Peoples are Indigenous, but Maroons are Indigenous, as I said, and not First Peoples. So that consent has to come from these groups based on all of this interaction that is rooted in free, prior, and informed sharing of information. And there are channels for Indigenous peoples to express their disagreement But oftentimes those channels occur after the fact. So you find, for example, corporations like the Marriott Corporation that's built hotels in indigenous lands, and there have been resistance to that protest and reports that have been filed to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. But those are also often after the fact. There have been a series of cases that have been arbitrated in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, for example, by Maroons of Suriname. Their lands have been invaded by loggers, by mineral extractors. But that, again, it happens after the fact, and it, ostensibly to establish a future set of relationships. But coming in with the idea of free, prior, informed consent means that these processes are arrested before they even begin. So now I'm going to jump into some examples of the work that I've done with Maroon women, who you see here, 3 women in the right, who are the founders of the organization that was called the Maroons of the Diaspora, that has now morphed into the United Maroon Indigenous Peoples. In the center, Akila Jaramogi, who's a chief and Yoruba spiritual leader. The religion she practices, Orisha, is from the Yoruba people that made its way to Trinidad. And she's one of the partners that I work very closely with. Over here, circling here to her left, is Gama Mamaji. She is the paramount queen of the Maroons of Jamaica and the diaspora. She's a spiritual leader, a Gama. She's the first Gama, woman Gama, since the colonial period. And over to the right here is the Honorable Fidelia Grant Galan. She is currently Suriname ambassador to Ghana. She was Suriname ambassador to Trinidad. The 3 of them and I came together in 2017, although they had all been working together since 2014. But we came together in 2017 and started to work on uniting the Maroons of the diaspora, creating an organization under which this uniting can take place, and thinking about organizing to be recognized as Indigenous peoples. Down below is Mamaji's family. These are her grandchildren and her partner, Akin, who also became a Gama when Mamaji was installed. Mama, the term Mama is a kind of an African retention. Women who have been recognized for their achievements, who are well respected, are often given the term Mama as a sort of a mother of all. And so that this is a number of years ago. They're older now, but what I'm sharing here is some slides from the annual Maroon Conference that happens in Charlestown, Jamaica, where a group of us shared our intention to organize with other colonels. The word colonel is used for Maroon leaders. Colonel, chief, or captain. Those are the terms that are used. It's interesting that they are colonial words, but they have been adopted by the men leaders of the Maroon communities, and we came to share with them the mission of organizing for unity and for recognition of indigeneity. So this was a pivotal moment to acquire their blessings and sanctions for moving forward. In 2018, then, we traveled to some Maroon villages in Suriname, often by boat. Many of the villages are on the river. Suriname, as a country, has recognized Maroons, and there's an annual celebration, which is a public holiday. And those celebrations are important because they raise consciousness. There is not such a holiday across the region for other Maroons, but it's something that Maroons are working towards. They are even working towards, in their organizing, one day that acknowledges all Maroons across the region, so a kind of transnational recognition. I'm continuing, just sharing some examples of the collaboration. We traveled through those canoes into the interior, into Maroon communities, where we met with not only Maroon leaders, but Maroon villagers, and shared with them the mission that I've just explained to you. And I've highlighted some concepts here because this is partly how I see my own role. I witnessed Mama G's role as a spiritual leader. This is the first time that some Maroons in Suriname became aware in these deep interior forests that there were other Maroons in other parts of the region. You know, the Grand Marinage brought them into such such deep isolation for so long. And its travel is very difficult. Now, while there's cell phones and other modern technologies now in many spaces, it was fascinating to see that they had not developed yet an awareness. It wasn't in their curriculum, their school curriculum, that there were Maroons elsewhere. But they immediately welcomed her and took her on as their spiritual leader. And the reason was because she spoke to them in a way where they recognized, even though they are from the Dutch-speaking Caribbean, and they have their own languages, there were common words that had been retained that she used, and common dances. She did a dance that they recognized, and women from this group where you see sitting here got up and joined her. There were also common drum rhythms. And so the process of identifying and actualizing unity took place here. So I observed these cultural expressions of linguistic terminology, spirituality, dance, and music. And I also delivered a talk on why Maroons should seek Indigenous status through the UN, how it will help them in accessing their rights through the UN Declaration. And then there was a signing of the Declaration, a public signing, to establish their inviolable sovereignty and right to self-determination and have it irrefutably recognized, so Maroon peoples can live the lives their ancestors fought and died to secure for them. They are motivated by the spirituality of their belief in the living ancestors. I have to move quickly now because of time, but we traveled also to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. We've traveled to the Caribbean Studies Association conference and presented in this joint fashion the objectives of the Maroon organizing. And there's one quote that I'll read some excerpts to you from. This is part of the goal is to address the colonial laws that have constrained sovereignty, such as some of the spiritual practices. There's a practice in the Caribbean known as obeah. Obeah is often regarded as sorcery and witchcraft. As you can see here, Kila Jaramogi, who I showed to you, says that obeah is a spiritual practice related to voodoo, hoodoo, and other West African practices. There's a reason for the K that I can talk about later if you're curious. And it was intentionally demonized by the British colonizers so that even many across the region fear obeah, and that there are anti-obeah laws now that they're trying to overthrow. We also met in Waitikabuli. There was a gathering with the First Peoples, the Kalinago, a smoke ceremony that was a spiritual gathering that opened the portal to the ancestors. This is the shaman of the Kalinago people, Gerald Langlace, and this is the Garifuna ambassador at large, Labafu Osene. And it shows the coming together of Maroons and First Peoples who often share a common heritage. Some discussions that we shared together, part of the collaboration, the listening, the learning, the building of friendships. This is a ritual that pays homage to Maroons who were captured by the British and hung in a marketplace square for seeking their liberation. And we came there to honor them and to pay homage. Another list here of various kinds of publications, conferences that I've collaborated on, using my journal as a way to to provide funding through fellowships for travel to conferences, and not skirting the blind review process and other processes that are set in place, but opening up the opportunity to apply for fellowships and to submit articles through that blind review process, which has yielded some results. I'm moving now to another aspect of collaborative partnerships, which is to talk about briefly bringing students. This is a group of students that I brought, and I've over the years brought students into these communities. This is at the Fonsamans Community Reforestation Community. These in Trinidad, they're learning about folklore, they're learning about ways of life. They're there to do service learning projects to figure out with the community members what kinds of support as students they can offer, whether it's recording stories or identifying the ways in which climate resilient trees are doing in this forestry project, all kinds of things, collaborating together on research projects that are of use and value to the community. Here they're working in the forestry project alongside community members in their gardens, in these, what these are called, these are dams that catch water during heavy rains. Now to close, there's so much here, and I know I've been talking fast, but I don't want to close without sharing with you this new initiative that's been going on for about a year now. When my current organization, the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, was selected to work as a consultant for the Caribbean Development Bank on a project that the bank wanted to undertake, deepening their knowledge of Indigenous peoples of the region, they asked for guidance in how to do this. And so one of the first things that I said is that they needed to establish ethical guidelines. Many banks have this, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the IMF, but the Caribbean Development Bank, which is the largest, most significant development bank in the region, had no specific, excuse me, guidelines for working with Indigenous peoples. So I did a lot of research and I worked with my team, and also the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group, which is a body of Indigenous peoples from the region that the Caribbean Development Bank established at the urging of my office to review these ethical guidelines and any steps that are taken to conduct research and assessments of needs in Indigenous communities. So we're not going to have time to go through this in great detail, but I wanted to share some of the aspects here. So first of all, we recognize that the CDB, the Caribbean Development Bank, has some established practices that indicate their ethical engagement with Caribbean peoples broadly, and those are important to identify. We also recognize that this is a living document that can be adjusted as conditions change. Notice that the first article in the principles is free, prior, informed consent. This is a process. I've identified full and effective participation, the importance of fair and equitable benefit sharing from any interventions by the bank, culturally safe, non-exploitive interactions across all Caribbean Development Bank interventions, inclusion in nation-state constitutions during constitutional reviews, and the law and laws pertaining to Indigenous peoples. I've identified the nature of partnerships, so I've built on what other universities have done, as well as my own work, and requiring that the bank understands what it means to be a partner. Protection of the rights of Indigenous women and girls. I elaborated on some of them here so that you can see that under each of these, there's a full body of text that elaborates on what this means and how the bank should enact them. Violence against women and girls in Indigenous communities is often not surfaced. It's very sensitive for various reasons. When you're part of a movement to emphasize indigeneity, oftentimes other internal tensions and problems are not surfaced. Non-exploitation by the bank and recourse if there is exploitation, the value of collaboration, empowerment of Indigenous peoples, that they should be autonomously regarded. They have privacy and confidentiality, how they define that, how ethical dilemmas should be negotiated how communication should take place. And I'm very, very happy to say that in this bank's document, they agreed to include the importance of decolonizing knowledge and alternative worldviews, against exploring how disagreements and misunderstandings are addressed, and the role of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group. And coming out of this and in closing, it is my intention while I'm still at the University of the West Indies to encourage the university itself to adopt a set of ethical guidelines. Of course, like all universities, they have ethical protocols for research. There's an IRB that is required for all researchers, but it's not specific to Indigenous peoples. And finally, I want to close with a quote from one of the Indigenous activists from Guyana, who has encouraged all people to stop and to reflect on the Indigenous idea, the worldview of living in kinship, in interconnectedness with all other living things. He says, many people have disconnected with nature, living in concrete spaces with concrete walls. They don't know what it feels like to walk on the grass, to listen to the birds. And we can say we are guardians of the forest. They don't see that. Take some time in open space. Don't sit in your concrete walls or just look at pictures of nature on the computer. You have to feel it. So I encourage you to imagine your future as researchers, taking into account these many challenging but very rewarding and important sets of ethical obligations. Thank you. Would love to have some questions and dialogue now.
Thank you so much, Diana. I mean, this was very thought-provoking, very moving, very powerful. And I'm sure a lot of us have a lot of perspectives, questions, comments, experiences to share with you. Amongst a lot of different elements of Indigenous research methods that you shared, what really stood out for me was the method of friendship.
I knew you'd like that.
and partnership. And also what is really important is, because especially for those who all of us closely work with communities, different communities out in the field, at least I am always troubled by this question that where should I begin? How should I begin? What should I start with when I walk into a community space? By making sure that I respect their space, their culture, their emotions, their perspectives of existence, rather than not trying to go there and tell them what is good for them and what is bad for them. And it apparently appears to be a very, simple question, but when it comes into the case of application, I always, at my personal end, I find it very complicated. Obviously, and with you outlining so clearly the different methods, the different process of self-questioning, the different ways of going through the challenges, the possibilities, being challenged by the Indigenous community members with the approaches and perspectives, is what also clarifies a lot about how to walk in, how to sit together, think together, disagree together, and then walk together around and try to understand the various possibilities of knowledge building, caring, and sharing, and which is really very powerful and amazing. Obviously, I have but in fact two questions, but I just don't want to occupy the space. I would like to open it up to the platform. If anybody of you would like to put up a question, just raise your hands, feel free to unmute and share, or else just put your question in the chat box or any comments on the chat box, and I'll be very happy to read it out for you. No worries at all.
Cheyenne, can I just address one of the points actually that you made about entering into communities?
Sure.
When I first started my fieldwork in Jamaica, I did just that. I was dropped off, by somebody. I was working with an American anthropologist, and I was flown into Kingston, and I traveled to this interior community, and I was I was doing a project on as a graduate student on crack cocaine. And I was taken by a drug enforcement official, American drug enforcement, into this community and just dropped there. And I had to find my way. But I speak to people and tell them what I was doing there. My approach is very different now, particularly with Indigenous peoples. There are protocols. So with the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group that I just mentioned, we have weekly meetings where we talk about how can our IGDS, our Institute for Gender and Development Studies team, come into the community, and work with you to identify, the kinds of needs. We're doing a needs assessment study. And one of the first things that I actually insisted on was that our two IGDS researchers work with two Indigenous researchers. They can be any individual who's knowledgeable about the community, from the community, selected by the community as a collaborative team, and they receive the same funding support from the bank as anybody else would. But we also asked them, what are the protocols for entering into communities? And with many Indigenous peoples, they have leaders in their communities. In Guyana, it's the Taushaus. The Tashao, it has a council. The government of Guyana has established a national Tashao council. And sometimes the Tashao villagers, don't necessarily always agree with that national Tashao council. So first, required by law, we have to tell the Tashao council what our project is, and ask them to recommend communities to us. And then we can go to the village Tashaus and say, this is what the national Tashao said, and how do we go from here? And so that's one way, is to identify the leaders in the communities, to ask them what their protocols are. How can I do research in your community? Do you have a process set up? If they don't have a process set up, then there are always leaders, community leaders or group leaders. If you're interested in a particular topic, you find out who they are and you approach them, and you don't just come in and start doing research.
Absolutely, Diana. I mean, this is such an important point to start with. Like, where do we, where are those spaces in terms of organizations, councils, individuals, where we should be humble enough and respectful enough to approach and first get an idea of the framework, the space, the emotions, and the cultures in which the communities work, rather than walking in with our own presumptions and preconceived expectations. I see Tanya has a raised hand. So Tanya, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the lecture. I'd like to ask a question about the consents, because I work in the Ivory Coast with a community who speaks really a language that is not written. So some of them do not read or write, and I'm not talking about, and sometimes they never experienced internet or like any publications. So how can I get a consent in such a situation?
Right. Yeah. So this is a really excellent example of the ways in which there are juxtaposed systems. So IRB processes at universities require a signed consent form. And sometimes, I've done it in various ways. Sometimes once I've established trust, a rapport with people, I can have I can bring in an actual printed form, and I can read it to them. And sometimes I can say, you can put a thumbprint or a mark if you don't write and have a signature. The other way to do it is to record consent and to work with a translator. And I think that's a preferred way, because it allows them to engage with someone from their community who is reading the consent form in their language, and asking them any questions that may have, and then seeking their verbal consent that is now recorded in a password protective account. So it's there, and it satisfies the requirements for the university or whatever organization you're working through, because it has that consent, but it does it in a way that works with their oral culture.
Okay.
Have you
Thank
tried
you.
that?
That's
Have
clear.
you tried
Yeah, that's
that?
clear. That I never tried to make a video, but that's a good idea. And the second part of my question is about internet and internet access to the data. Like, how can I ask for consent about the things that they never experienced and probably will never experience? I don't know, like probably one day they will understand what, like, and they will see and use the internet, and they will see the materials published, and they would see that probably from the neighbor village also can listen to the audios we have recorded together. So
Is there nobody
how
from the
to work with it?
community? Is there anybody from the community who's left the community to go into other spaces? And many groups have sent sort of individuals as kind of ambassadors for their groups to be formally educated in a university, so that they are equipped with the knowledge and the skills that are needed to negotiate, whether it's around resource extraction, land use, or whatever it may be. So I would think that there would be some people who have left the community who you might be able to track down, and who can then come back, or people who are in neighboring communities who they have relationships with, maybe through trade or some kind of resource sharing, maybe even through marriage arrangements if they have endogamous marriage. And I would try to work with some people who are able to explain what this is. What is that there is a mechanism for communicating using, an electrical system that connects people. And I would show them. I think that it's, when I was first trained, as an anthropologist, I was told, no, that you're not supposed to introduce anything new. Well, that's a kind of ridiculous requirement, because just your presence being there is something new. So the question is how to do it ethically, right? And so in my view, the way to do it ethically is to engage others who are closely connected to them, who have had broader experiences, who can then explain to them, what this system is, why you might want to share it. And it's imperative that you explain to the community, what is the value of sharing? Why are you doing this? Is it knowledge only? Is it just to disseminate knowledge so that other people can know about them? And why? Why is that important? What are the implications of that knowledge being out there? Is it possible that some corporation, some extractive industry, some developers might say, oh, there's this community here that's largely undeveloped, it's untapped, and now we know about it, and it could open up a pathway for intervention that is really problematic. So I think it's really important that and understand very well what the reasons are for sharing, for using any actual names, rather than having an anonymous community, and also think through the potential implications of having that information out there. Maybe they won't want it out there. You cannot, though, disseminate broadly without getting their approval. You certainly can't use names of communities or individuals without their consent. So it's crucial that you do the groundwork to find individuals who are in a position to talk to your community members, and that they understand what's happening.
Thank you.
Yeah, it might mean that it takes longer, but that's okay. It would be awful if something happened, that as a result, that people were compromised or their land was compromised and something happened that, you could trace back to your work.
Great. Thank you so much for the questions and the conversation. I don't know if you have anybody else would like to go ahead with any other question, comments, reflections. Oh, yes, Kathy, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Diana, for this really amazing, interesting, and also very useful talk. I think even if you don't work with Indigenous communities, but you work with communities in some capacity as an activist or as a researcher or both, what you just presented us is really useful. I work with Native American researchers, but but not in an ethnographic capacity. But I do kind of I did kind of ethnographic work, artistic work in not non-Indigenous communities. But I think I can apply a lot of what you said, because those communities are very vulnerable. And I think all of these processes of like really thinking through what it means if information about these individuals is online in the internet, right? What it could mean for these people, like looking into an unknown future in a way, and kind of like estimating is really important, or can be really important in a lot of directions. But I wanted to ask, I'm also, like Sayan, interested in this concept of friendship as activism. And I want to ask you especially about how you deal with, or how you can apply this concept, especially when differences come up, differences in opinion, but also differences in resources, and all of these things that make work so complicated. And I would want to hear a little bit of how you work through that, how this, what you do if these things appear, and
Yeah,
how you can maintain the friendship
right. Yeah.
in that. Yeah.
I mean, I have so many stories that I can share of ways in which, I've learned from my mistakes. But, resource issues are real. Resource differences are real. I mean, I have a steady salary, but I also, have my own, challenges. I have a daughter in university, I have a mortgage, and sometimes explaining those things and explaining costs, so that, I mean, the cost of a university education in the United States, compared to what it costs to enroll at the University of the West Indies. Even though it's a challenge for people living in the Caribbean, and is something that is worth talking about. So I think being comfortable sharing your own vulnerabilities, so that you break down this assumption that, because you're a white European woman, you necessarily have you're free and fine, and you have no financial stresses, is something that's important in that regard. Also, sometimes in other areas and other kinds of differences, I'll just share a brief story. Recently, in last March, my office invited the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to the University of the West Indies in Jamaica to tour Indigenous communities in Jamaica, to learn about them, to try to get them on the radar of the UN. And it brought people from about 15 different countries, Indigenous peoples from different countries in the Caribbean. And we spent a few days at the university campus, and then we embarked on a bus trip around the island. And before the bus trip, a number of the women wanted to, including my dear friend Akila, wanted to lead a kind of spiritual circle. And, you know, I have been open about my own religious or non-religious beliefs. You know, I consider myself a spiritual person, but I'm not a religious person. And I've talked about, you know, what it means a little bit to be a Jewish person, especially today in the United States and in the region. But at that moment, I didn't feel like joining this spiritual circle. I know the value of this circle for them. I know that when they're in the circle, they strongly believe and enact a sense of community. They believe they're calling on the energy, the spirit of their ancestors. And they wanted me to join. They wanted everyone to join. And at first I said no. And I mean, even now I'm still learning. This is just March, right? I said no. And I said no because I don't know, I was exhausted. It was a rare moment. I had like 5 minutes I could be by myself on the bus after spending months organizing. And then some of the Maroon women came to me and said, please come. I said, I really don't want to. You know, we had this moment. And finally I realized, you cannot say no to this. You know, you have to engage with this. And so I did. I joined, and but I joined not in a resistant spirit. I decided that if I was going to join, I was going to be present, and I was going to really bring my whole self there. And it was a positive experience. It was a unifying experience. And so I give this example to say that, you know, sometimes, you know, recognizing that's a reciprocity. I needed to give that reciprocity to them. And I didn't think in the moment, I was thinking in terms of myself. So along the way, there are moments when we have to think, what more can we give? And then later, after the event, when everyone left and went home, we had a Zoom meeting that was kind of deconstructing the week, where we all talked openly about some of the challenges, some of the tensions. So we've opened up spaces to discuss this, and I think that's part of that process. Also, opening up by saying, this is in a spirit of love. We care about each other. We care about our mission. We want it to work. You know, we've had disagreements. There were just all kinds of disagreements about where we should go for lunch, the vegetarians or the meat, things like that just happen, right? But you always keep in your mind, you know, what the ultimate goal is, and the care for one another. That ethic of care has to be you know, first. And the communication has to be ongoing. So I would say those, you know, there's a lot more to say, and I'm happy to talk to you about it more in another setting if you want. But you know, it's the communication, the making yourself vulnerable, the sharing with others so that they understand you more too, is really crucial.
Thank you so much for the questions and the responses. I can see Shohel's hand is raised. Yeah, please go ahead, Shohel.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. But I have a two questions actually. First thing is, being a Caucasian woman and educated from the Eurocentric point of view, why you want to do this research? And second thing is, being outsider through your you know, a reflection, especially when you are thinking about your reflexivity within the process, and what is the things you can advise for someone who is coming from outside, doing decolonization in a endogenous community?
Right. Well, thank you for that question. So first of all, I don't call myself Caucasian. I reject those racial categorizations that were developed. I'm white presenting, I'm Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jewish. And if you look at the DNA, my DNA, I can trace it back to the Middle East and to Turkey and to, how, now, and I know that how one presents affects how people interact with you. So, in US spaces and in Caribbean spaces, I will have that immediate kind of white privilege, although in many spaces, there's a kind of ambiguity because my hair is curly, and even, you can't see me right now, but I have a kind of olivey tone. So people often don't know what I am. And so they often ask me, are you, people have thought I was Egyptian, Italian, all kinds of things. So that ambiguity, and in Jamaica, once I have a tan, people call me brownin. Brownin is a sort of racialized term for brown people. And my one of our graduate students here, one PhD student, Helen Atkins from Jamaica, is here, right? And Helen, you probably would be considered brownin in Jamaica, right?
Yes, I would say it doesn't happen all the time, but not infrequently out and about on the streets, it would be shouted maybe from across the road. It's considered to be a compliment, but I always want to turn around and shout back gravy, because to me it's it's a cooking liquid,
Right.
not a person.
Right, yeah, exactly. So I think part of the reason I explained my own positionality is because when I talk to people, when you develop these partnerships and collaborations, which takes time, it involves getting to know one another and learning about one another's background. Now, I first came to Jamaica, as I said, as a graduate student, but how I think about, my privilege of being educated in the United States, definitely in a kind of Eurocentric perspective, although, as I said, anthropology was challenging that at the time that I was in graduate school. I have thought about how to harness the resources of being a university professor, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in my position now in Jamaica. It was because of my being in my position now in Jamaica that I was able to invite a UN special rapporteur to come to Jamaica, and that opened up a lot for the indigenous peoples of the region. So it put them on the map in a way, and he developed an understanding of their indigeneity. It helped move along their goal of being recognized as indigenous. So what's crucially important is to figure out, for me, and I think what I would share with others, who are the social movement actors? What kind of liberatory and emancipatory change do they want to take place for their own community? How can the external anthropologist or other researcher work with them to help them achieve their goals? What resources from the university, from grants, again, from publishing? I have tried my very best to open up all of the opportunities that are available to me to share with them, so that they are now their work, their goals are now on platforms that previously wouldn't have been there. And that has given them visibility to counter the ongoing invisibility and narrative of extinction. It has brought conversations to the government, who met with the special rapporteur. The Minister of Culture, invited us to have dinner with the special rapporteur, and then she spent the whole night grilling him on who are indigenous peoples and what does it mean for the state if they're recognized as indigenous. It brought a conversation and it advanced also other discussions around reparations for enslavement. So I think that there are very intentional ways that we can use our positionality, those power dynamics, those access to certain kinds of resources, not just money, but opportunities, to help social movement actors move their goals along to achieve those liberatory, self-determined spaces that they wish to live in. Hope that answers the question.
Well, still, we are talking about giving them, but what we are getting from them in terms
I'm not talking about giving them. I'm talking about collaborating with them, deciding with them, what do you want to achieve? It's not just a giving. It's a collaboration, which is very different.
Yeah, well, in terms of opening up and bringing the opportunity, the kind of thing. So whether they are thinking that as an opportunity or not, that is another question in terms of what we are offering them, whether they are accepting it as a good or bad. So that kind of conversation, I think what we learn from them is also being part of the decolonization process.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the whole ethic, for example, um, of interconnectedness, right? Of all my relations. That is a crucial perspective that those of us who are not Indigenous, for example, should really think about adopting. That's why I closed with the quote that I closed with, because if you look at a tree only as a resource rather than as a living being, an entity tied to other living entities, then you're missing something significant, and you're furthering the mentality that leads to this biospheric crisis that we're in. So there are philosophies, there's ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of interacting with people and with the planet that these communities have a lot to share. So the opening up of the opportunities in this collaborative way also builds awareness, consciousness, gives people an opportunity to think about how they might change their own thought processes and their own actions. I hope that addresses it.
Great. Thank you so much for the discussions. I think we are almost there. I mean, this is such a fantastic perspective to engage with. Probably it's a never-ending process. But I don't know, we can have one small quick question. Sorry, I see Kathy, you have unmuted. Would you like to go ahead with something?
No, I was just going to say that we're already out of time because I
Oh.
think we were supposed to end 20 past. But I would like to take the opportunity to thank you again, Diana, for this amazing talk, and also thank you very much, Cyan, for the moderation, and everybody for all the questions. And yeah, I think if it's okay for everybody, I would call it a day. And
Thank you.
I hope very much that I will see you all tomorrow for Cyan's presentation.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the opportunity and the wonderful, challenging questions.
Bye, everybody.